resistance in Brazil, but we'll also look at some other qualities that are more global, more universal, things that we can apply to any social context, any culture, any society. These are some core principles that we can use as a lens to analyze when a group of people, often poor individuals or people who are socioeconomically excluded, take the means of authority, the means of the economy, and use it against those who are oppressing them, so the wealthy. This is something we can see repeatedly throughout time and something that is increasingly visible in our current modern global economy where economic inequality is growing rapidly based off of the international and global trade of goods. So as we go forward, we're going to be looking at some of the core principles that we can use to describe resistance in general, but we're going to look at some very specific case studies. The first things that come to mind often when we talk about resistance in contemporary society are some more recent movements that took place in the first few decades of the new millennium. Occupy Wall Street was probably one of the more principal ones. This emerged in 2008, 2009 as the result of the US economic crisis, the US housing crisis that sent the country's economy and many economies throughout the world into a recession. More or less, the major grievance in this was the possession of 99% of the resources by 1% of the population. And so you have the idea that there's a 99% of the population that is being used by 1% of the population. So it's a socioeconomic argument. What were some of the concrete actions that Occupy Wall Street took? They took over public space. They went to parks. They occupied parks, often illegally or against regulations and rules of the state and the government. And they also tried to organize a non-hierarchical social movement, something that was capable of not reproducing some of the socioeconomic inequalities that were the principal goal or the principal target of critique by this movement. We also had the Arab Spring. This emerged separately, but also something that was very much connected to widespread economic inequality. Specifically, it started in the Arab world in northern Africa. A lot of long-term dictators, often supported by the United States, had produced an oligarchy, had produced a concentration of wealth in specific aspects of society, often people who worked for the government, and often neglected vast portions of their citizens. This isn't to say that previous governments, specifically colonial governments, weren't problematic. This is definitely the case. European colonizers in northern Africa and the Arab world were not friends of the Arab people, but the Arab Spring took this one step further. They looked at those people who were governing their nations, their countries, and they were throwing critiques at them. This resulted in overthrows of governments throughout the Arab world, and also probably the most deadly example was the Syrian conflict that more or less became resolved in 2019, and now they have to deal with the aftermath of that. But once again, economic inequalities that arose to challenge the oligarchical elite. Public space was being taken, the means of production were being taken, and also there was some iconoclastic actions being taken. Long-standing respect for national rulers was often disregarded in a way that was iconoclastic, that tried to break down icons within a society. We also have the Black Lives Matter movement. This is a principally racially based movement, and when I say that, it's a movement that was based off of critiquing racial oppression. And when we look at some of the more pointed examples of this movement, we can see that they are concerned about police abuse, that they are specifically police abuse in the African American community in the American city. And we can also see that there are some secondary arguments going on. What helped produce police abuse, high indices of incarceration and police abuse in the African American city? We can see that this is a product not only of segregation, white flight, something that took place in the 1960s, so all the white communities left the city and moved to the suburbs, leaving more or less a weakened city government, city social service system for a community that had been historically subjugated by the white population. In the north of the United States, we can see that there was a great migration, and even then, the African American communities were still struggling with a legacy of enslavement and a legacy of legalized segregation and legalized discrimination. So we see that the Black Lives Matter movement then was also making a socioeconomic argument, saying that often what we were experiencing, what the African American community was experiencing, is directly related to being denied the means of production, denied fair access to the economy, and also not being able to participate as a citizen in a modern democracy driven by capitalism. Then we also have the Women's March. This is a march that is stemming from the concerns of feminist scholars, feminist activists, individuals who are looking specifically at the inequalities that are based off of gender in a patriarchal society, that is the United States. This was something that was looking for stronger laws to protect women against the abuses of men, stronger laws that would help to guarantee equal rights and equal privileges to women, which are still not necessarily the case. We can see the inequality in pay as being one central concern of feminist scholars and feminist activists. We can also see that there is a critique of domestic versus professional work. So not just pay, but also the type of work that is traditionally assigned to women in our society is often domestic work. So that's the least prestigious work, the work that gives less control over money and economic resources. So we see that our forms of social justice activism in the modern United States are directly tied to socioeconomic resistance, trying to find a point of oppression and a point of contention that can help to alleviate and organize individuals, but alleviate populations who are being oppressed. We can refer to a work by James Scott. This is not Jason Scott. I'm Jason Scott. There's also a James Scott. He wrote principally in the 1980s. He was an anthropologist, sociologist, historian, philosopher, and he was looking at the role of oppression and resistance in society in his work, Everyday Forms of Peasant Resistance. In this, he outlines some of the characteristics that are normally assigned to rebels or resistance groups. And he also wants to look at the very basic everyday forms of resistance. So not necessarily these forms of resistance that are going out to the street and tearing down governments and occupying public spaces, but even those everyday forms of resistance, talking badly behind someone's back, being a little bit less productive at work. These are all forms that individuals who are socioeconomically marginalized are capable of resisting forms of oppression. And I'll point here to right on this screen that throughout this presentation, I'm going to have a number of examples of resistance and rebellions that took place throughout time. We can see in countless examples that it is usually dealing with economic concerns. Money is a key driver. It seems to be able to get rid of racial difference, get rid of different ethnic differences when everyone is commonly being exploited economically by the elite or by those who are in authority. Scott asks, does peasantry matter? So he's looking specifically at rural peasantry, and he is seeing in a historical context that peasantry really only matters when it is a violent revolution. What does that mean? It means that often we don't have a historical record when there is a peasant revolution. When it becomes violent, when the elite have to lose something physically, or whether that's a material good, a investment, an economic resource, or even their lives or their persons, that is when it often becomes a recordable historic event. That is often when the peasants who resist often become historically important. Other than that, we don't really see many peasants show up in the historical text, and we're talking about 100 years, 200 years going past. It is a history of the elite, a history of the oppressor, but not the history of those people who are working the means of production and working to help produce things in society. So even brief revolts often can produce minor concessions from those in power. They can show that they can disrupt their societies enough that the elite realize they have to make a concession. But then often we see that the peasants invest in a new political icon, a new political authority that slowly but surely erodes the rights given to peasants during that uprising, and then the peasants end up coming back to where they started, being oppressed, being socioeconomically marginalized. We can see this time and again take place in society. Otherwise, peasants are just ignored. They are often distorted by the state, their experiences distorted by the state. They are not necessarily given voice. Often they are seen as passive players. They are seen as happy players, content players, people who are benevolently governed over. And then they also are conveniently ignored in many ways when we talk about economic development. Often when we talk about economic development, instead of talking about peasants, we talk about the wealthy, we talk about the elite, we talk about those individuals who are controlling the means of production, the factories, the farms. Those individuals are the ones who get to have voice. So then, everyday forms of resistance are often expunged from the record, according to Scott. We see that they are excluded from the record or overtly erased. We see that people in power intentionally keep them anonymous. They might record a crime, they might record something getting stolen, something getting vandalized, a form of violence against someone who is an oppressor. But often the reasoning behind those individuals' acts are ignored. They are washed over, and we see that that individual is often just seen as a poor, socioeconomically marginalized deviant and not given voice. There's often no headlines when this happens. There's often no overt public discussion that happens. Instead, and this is paraphrasing Scott, we see the grinding, quiet struggle over rents, crops, labor, and taxes, in which submission and stupidity is often no more than a pose, a necessary tactic. In other words, we see that there is a lot of subtle things going on that often get described as laziness, that often get described as a example of why individuals are not entitled to be the elite, to be in control of things. So, oh, they're lazy, look at them. They do not deserve to run the means of production. Like me, I'm effective and I'm efficient. Give me more resources. Very simple and convenient argument. And then we can also see that these everyday forms of resistance, so once again, refusal to pay rent, refusal to harvest crops, refusal to work at a pace that a landlord wants, refusal to pay taxes, all of these are not necessarily things that are going to show up and have an archaeological footprint. They are things that happen and they get forgotten and they get washed over. The peasant gets punished, and often we see no historical artifact being representative of these actions. Sometimes they lead to direct resistance, armed rebellion. I will talk about a few of these today, but when we talk about armed rebellion and armed resistance, this is the most rare culmination of resistance. Scott uses the case study of mechanization in Malaysia during the 1970s and 80s. This was during a time called the Green Revolution throughout the world. This is when mechanization and scientific techniques were used to exponentially increase the production of food in the global south, in underdeveloped worlds, in the underdeveloped countries throughout the world. This had dramatic social effects. It didn't just encourage the mass production of food and put food in people's bellies, but it eliminated a lot of jobs. It eliminated a lot of historically important jobs that were the basis of caste and class based societies. And over the process of 5 years in Malaysia, we see that 80% of the rice paddies went from being cultivated by hand to cultivated by machine. So we can think about 80% of the land now no longer requires an extensive form of manual labor. Instead, we see that managed by a few well-trained individuals who may be peasants, or former peasants, but we see that those few individuals are now the only ones that are allowed to work the land, and the rest of the individuals have to go to find other work, often going to the city, often going and being in the service sector, often being once again marginalized within a society socioeconomically. What were some of the effects that Scott noted in Malaysia? We see that small landholders, marginal tenants, and landless wage laborers all lost income within the matter of 10 years. They lost their jobs. Within the matter of 10 years, the economy was no longer built in order to benefit them. And also, we see some secondary effects that took place. That would be there was no necessary secondary market associated with waste. We can see in more well-developed economies that include peasantry and include various classes, that there is often specific classes of individuals, specific professions that are specifically geared towards reprocessing the waste that is within a society. Instead, we see that surplus crops are often disposed of or eliminated or avoided. It is not a maximization necessarily of goods and of agriculture for the benefit of the people, but rather to make a global good that's a global commodity that can be traded. We see that there's fewer types of jobs that are getting created. So instead of having this very detailed, non-mechanized society, very differentiated forms of work, we see that there are fewer forms of work geared towards a specific set of mechanized infrastructure that must be maintained in order to continue the production of this green revolution. We see that there's lower wages since there's much more competition for these fewer jobs. We see that there is a great deal more advantages given to employers, given to people who are paying wages. They can pick who they want. They can select who they want. They can fire people a lot easier because there's a lot more people looking for jobs. And then we can see that the concentration of power is in the hands of the already powerful. In Malaysia, for example, there was a intense caste system often tied to the agricultural production process. And the people who were allowed to capitalize the most were the people who were at the top of the system, who were able to organize and get loans to get machines to replace the peasants and then to retain power within their own social status, but not share that authority or that wealth with individuals who are now out of work. So, according to Scott, how can we define resistance? Resistance is often defined by its restraints, so what people can't do, what people aren't allowed to do, the limits placed on individuals, and how they can slowly be broken and challenged. We can see that there is often more or less exploitation as the result of resistance. During the Green Revolution, for example, according to Scott, we see that there was higher degrees of exploitation with increased efficiency. So this is often counter to the argument that increased efficiency is logical and beneficial for all of society. And in fact, there is greater degrees of economic exploitation with the introduction of more mechanized and modern agricultural techniques. We can see that without having a complex class system, there is a little bit more struggle to form a collective class consciousness, because once you disrupt all those traditional roles, everyone then becomes a laborer. and everyone has to fight for their own space, their own socioeconomic status. Once again, they have to reform their ideas and identities and how they conceptualize themselves. So they're not referencing these more traditional systems, these more traditional identities and beliefs. And then we can also see, when we're defining resistance, the duress of the quotidien. What does this mean? The struggle of the everyday. How we can see how peasants struggle every day. What are some types of resistance according to Scott? And these are just some really good analytical things. We're talking about, once again, the duress of the quotidien. We are looking at specifically how we can identify, as social scientists, as scholars, as humanists, how we can identify resistance in the everyday. We can see theft as one of the biggest examples. It is considered a form of repossession if you are someone who is against socioeconomic oppression. Imagine if you're working on a farm and there is a great deal of produce getting produced, and once you leave, you don't have enough wages to produce or buy that product once you get home, because the socioeconomic system is often based off of global standards of commodity exchange, and you are unable to go and get the same food that you harvest. What happens when you go and steal that? You are repossessing your labor. You are making an adjustment to the socioeconomic inequality that oppresses you. We also can see sabotage. Scott uses the idea of sabotaging tractors, old farm tractors. If they don't work, the boss can't make money. You can see boycotts. This is a collective action where people refuse to buy goods made by farmers or made on farms that had dispossessed the peasantry. We can also see desertion. This is often moving to a different farm, a different community, or often, and we saw this in the Green Revolution a lot, the concentration of populations and density within cities across the developed world. And then we can see how all this blocks the mode of production. If you can see that the peasantry is preventing a wealthy person from getting wealthier, that could be considered a form of resistance in many different ways. So how can we define resistance then, considering Scott? This is pulled almost word for word from Scott. Lower class resistance among peasants is an act or acts by members of the class that is intended either to mitigate or to deny claims, such as rents, taxes, and deference or respect made on that class by a superordinate class, such as landlords or state owners of machinery, moneylenders, or to advance its own claims over work, land, and charity vis-a-vis the superordinate classes. So, putting this a little bit simpler, we can see that there is a form of resistance when a marginalized individual is able to claim authority over something that a rich person has denied them, or a powerful and authoritative person has denied them. Beyond this, we can see that there is no collective requirement. We don't have to see a super organized, really well organized movement of peasants with a chain of command or even a riot. We can see it in the everyday. We can see it as being symbolic and ideological. So being able to, I'm just thinking of the women's movement during the 1970s, the refusal to wear bras, undergarments, was considered a way to strike down the patriarchal beauty standards that existed during the time and continue to exist today. And then we should see resistance not just in its immediate effects, but also in what the peasantry was trying to express and what they intended for the resistance to produce. Because often we can see, and this is seen in countless examples, that the peasants do not necessarily achieve what they want because they don't have power. So how do we analyze something that didn't happen? Well, we can look at intentions. Scott also wants to make a quick clarification between real resistance and token resistance. Real resistance in this respect is organized, principled, selfless, consequential. It has a consequence and is meant to negate or deny domination. It is something that is meant specifically to be against domination. It is not something that is meant to be self-serving, and it is not something that is simply unorganized, opportunistic, and selfish. Selfish being people rioting and looting luxury goods, for example. This could be a form of taking back and repossessing of forms of wealth, but then we can also see that there might be some selfish reasons to use resistance as an opportunity to hoard wealth for yourself. We can see that token resistance is non-consequential, but once again, we can see that even by expressing intentions, you have produced something concrete. Even by being able to express and verbally deny the power that oppresses you, you have achieved something. So we can see it often produces consequences based off of those in power and those in authority. They want to put down resistance. So even if you don't achieve what you intend, there's still going to be a consequence to it. And also, token resistance does not accommodate domination. So we can see that there are countless rebellions and organized resistance examples throughout history, but often these are waged by individuals who want to reassert oppression and domination of socioeconomically marginalized individuals. Thinking of the Ku Klux Klan as one great example of a token form of resistance. When the Ku Klux Klan is going out and terrorizing African Americans in the post-Civil War South, they are not doing so to achieve respect for the socioeconomically marginalized. They are trying to reassert their domination over a socioeconomically marginalized group. So they are not resistance, they are token resistance. What are other weapons of the week that we can think of? And this is something that is an important sociological question, anthropological question. When we look at specific cultures, specific times, and specific eras, I would like to think that the modern use of social media is a weapon of the week because it helps to disrupt in many ways the authority of ideological domination and of individuals who have historically been able to control society's discourse, such as politicians, the wealthy, the elite. As we go forward in this lecture, we'll see some examples of different things that people did, but they often fall along these socioeconomic ways to resist. History of resistance in Brazil goes back to the first and earliest days of colonization, when the indigenous populations were attempting to fight back against European colonization and European genocide. We see a number of indigenous rebellions and indigenous insurrections that took place in the early days of Brazil. These could also be considered slave rebellions because during this time the indigenous populations were being enslaved and they were resisting their enslavement through either taking back the means of production or trying to flee and go into the interior of Brazil. We see that there's a number of examples of this still today in existence with the idea of quilombos, which are former slave settlements that are built in the interior of Brazil, far from the coast. These have had important influences on Brazilian history, and we can see them in many different forms throughout the last 500 years. There are some other more noteworthy forms of resistance in the last 300 years or 350 years in Brazil. They often, once again, are based off of socioeconomic grievances, and we can see that there's some varying degrees of realness and tokenness as we go along. But in the history of Brazil, specifically, this is my field site. These are things that I see throughout time. I see these names, some of these names, and some references to this history throughout time. Most of these rebellions and these forms of resistance are directly cited by people who want to uphold the national identity of Brazil as a sovereign and independent state. And they see these individuals as freedom fighters who did not succeed during their time, but nonetheless inspired future generations. We have the Inconfidência Mineira, or the Minas Gerais conspiracy. Minas Gerais is a state in the interior of Brazil. It was the first interior state to really get wealth and prominence. You can go there. There's some 300-year-old buildings in there. And it is the first non-coastal city that really grew in Brazil. And Brazil, even to this day, has struggled with developing the interior parts of its country. And it tends to be some of the poorer regions are the interior regions. In the Minas Gerais conspiracy, we see that the decline of gold mining in 1789 really had a dramatic effect on the local elite. This is something that led to them critiquing a political system that was often concentrated in the capitals of Rio de Janeiro, in the regional capitals of the Northeast, and also in other coastal capitals. What did they do? They organized, they conspired based off of the ideas of the American Revolution, which was still white hot in the minds of all these freedom fighters at the time. Something that could have possibly contributed to the weakness of this movement, and also maybe something we could determine it to be a token, would be the principally white characteristic, racially white characteristic, European descendant characteristic of the rebellion. These were gold miners who had made a great deal of wealth based off of the exploitation of slaves and poor people of color. And they were also feeling abused by an even more authoritative Portuguese colonial state. Tiradentes is the leader, and we see on the screen here a depiction of his execution. They were rounded up, the conspirators were rounded up and executed. Tiradentes was a priest, a religious man who was the de facto leader. He helped organize individuals, and he was executed, decapitated, drawn, and quartered as punishment for his participation in the conspiracy. To this day, you can go across major cities and minor cities throughout Brazil, and there is a Praça de Tiradentes, a Tiradentes plaza that celebrates this man's martyrdom as a symbol for the democratic future of Brazil. And we can see here as something that might be an everyday form of resistance, a more symbolic or ideological form of resistance, is the fact that this never really got off the ground. This never really became a major rebellion or form of resistance. But the sheer fact that there was talk was enough threat to the sovereignty of the elite in Rio de Janeiro and in Portugal, and it was enough to justify the brutal murder of these individuals. We see the Conjuração Baiana, or the Tailors' Revolt, that it's often called in English, Baian Revolt, or the Tailors' Revolt, as we can see, and this takes place 10 years after the Minas Gerais conspiracy. We can see once again it is inspired by the American Revolution, the idea of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, equal rights, voting rights, and economic participation. We see that this is a more popular movement with broader racial participation than the Minas Gerais conspiracy. The principal organizers were either freed slaves or people who were descendant of free slaves, and the people who they were trying to overthrow were the Portuguese descendant, European descendant elite. This was during a time of economic decline and economic drought in Bahia. And we can see here, Bahia is along the coast, but it is at this point now the former colonial capital of Brazil. The products that were being produced, principally sugarcane, were not necessarily making as much money on the global market. There was a lot more competitors in the French and American and Dutch and English colonies at the time. And the Brazilian sugar industry was becoming incredibly more exploitative, incredibly more weak, and it ended up removing a lot of people, eliminating a lot of opportunities for social mobility and dignified work for individuals. What do we see then? It lasts 2 weeks, so it gets off the ground. They take control of some of the means of production, they take control of the government, and then the Portuguese crown comes in with a fleet of ships and captures all the rebels and executes them. And so we see here, once again, a depiction of the execution. And these images were highly visible at the time, obviously, as a warning for individuals who would want to resist again. And we can see, going back to some of the issues of tokenness and realness, there is a little bit more realness when we have a more racially inclusive form of resistance. The Revolução Pernambucana, or Pernambucan Revolution, took place once again on the coast, a little bit to the north of Bahia. This is a older colonial city that is also in economic decline. It is slowly despising the European elite that is taking over and occupying this part of Brazil. And they want more French, and they want more American, and they want more foreign influence. Right now, at this point, it's only the Portuguese that are allowed to colonize Brazil, and they have slaves. So you have a large slave population, or formerly slave population, and a small European population that is controlling all the means of production. During the Pernambucan Revolution, the demographics at the time were something like 15% European descendant or European, and 85% non-white. And those two groups were principally against each other. We see that this was also inspired by a more nativist philosophy. Brazil was still under the thumb of, this is 1810s, 1820s. We see that Brazil is still under the thumb of Portugal, and Brazil is not a fully independent state at this time. So Freemasons are small artisans that often can control a large number of people. They don't see themselves as part of the landed elite or the bankers or any other form of historical class system. This is really the free tradesman that still exists today, that's capable of working by themselves or organizing small teams of individuals to do highly qualified and professional work. These individuals are leading the Pernambucan Revolution. Frei Caneca, once again a Catholic priest, Catholic friar, is leading this, and he once again is executed. The resistance lasted 2 months. It received once again a great deal of resistance, or the resistance in Pernambuco, I should say, received a great deal of challenge from the Portuguese state, from the European state, and the Brazilian state, and eventually it failed, and we can see that Frei Caneca is tied up here, and he was also executed. This brings me to some more contemporary forms of resistance in Brazil, and I think these former examples of resistance are really well encapsulated by the film Bacurau from 2019. It connects to some of the important themes that we can discuss about Brazil: resistance, socioeconomic inequality, racial inequality throughout the history of Brazil. It was filmed in Rio Grande do Norte, which is just to the north of Bahia and Pernambuco. And it is something that depicts the sertão, the desert the underdeveloped inner regions of the state. So it becomes a very much like a desert region. It's in between the Amazon region and the coastal Mata Atlântica, the Atlantic forest, and it's a desert region that's been historically poor. The film Vidas Secas was about this and really depict this poverty very well. We can also see that there is an example of colonialismo. So this is the political economic system that emerged in Brazil in the 1890s with the rise of democracy, where local political leaders were able to concentrate not only political power within a machine, but also to concentrate economic power. And they use this to abuse the people, to concentrate wealth, to not allow individuals to rise with the benefits of a improving, more productive, and more efficient society. There's many different examples in the film that represent this. It takes place in a near future, that is a future of 2019. And we see that there is issues with water. There's a lot of technology in there. The story revolves around a gringo-led group of people hunting humans for sport. And it's interesting because this very surreal subject is placed on top of some very important cultural logics that we see in these marginal communities, these marginal forms of resistance. We see that individuals are often not productive. They often fight with the political leadership. They often do not follow their directions. They often do not fully inform those in power what's happening. There's a important scene or sets of scene that takes place in Bacurau's museum, something that I would definitely point out to when watching the movie. But more or less, if the oppressor, if the people attacking the village were paying attention to what the villagers were saying, they would not have found their eventual demise. We can also see another aspect of the film that really shows the everyday forms of resistance that take place and how often power fails to recognize forms of resistance and forms of existence that are against itself. The very name Bacurau, the name of the city, is not on the maps in the movie. And so what does this see? This means that not only does authority ignore the community, it also means that there's a lot taking place in the city that's not going to be recognized and not going to be viewed by authority. And so we can see, at least in the events of the film from beginning to the end, we see that there's very little intervention from outside the outside world, other than these sort of invaders that are coming and invading the community. We can also see some other examples. There's criminals in the community, and I'd pay attention to how criminals are treated in the community. People who are seen as deviants, they often are accepted and they are often reacted to in very sympathetic ways. This is very interesting. This film won a bunch of awards, including awards at Cannes Film Festival and awards in other international film festivals throughout the world. And it can really be seen as an example of a more global resistance, a marginalized group of individuals. We can see just here on the screen, at least in terms of Brazil, it's a multiracial group of individuals, but they're often individuals that don't necessarily fulfill the normative expectations of whiteness that people have in the United States. Nonetheless, we see that these individuals are very much representative of a global marginalized class, a form of global resistance, and a lot of their expressions, a lot of their concerns over society, when it is not being filtered through this sort of ultra-violent Hollywood-esque film, a lot of these concerns are getting expressed. A lot of these questions and problems with society that take place, a lot of these forms of learning and knowing the world are based off of marginalized perspectives. So things to pay attention to are some of these repeated themes about socioeconomic inequality, the types of intended and unintended consequences that take place, and what types of symbolic or ideological resistance is taking place in the film. The film also has, and this is just to point out some recent conversations in Brazil, not only does this film evoke the ideas of resistance that are expressed throughout the history of Brazil in these more marginalized hinterlands and these sort of Sertão regions. But there's also a lot of discussion in Brazil this day about global capital having too much influence. And this is something that comes up again every once in a while. It changes depending on who's in power. The tone of the conversation changes depending on who's in power, who's being critiqued. But we do see still a great deal of conversation and engagement with the idea of resistance. The three biggest examples of resistance that we can see in Brazil in the last 20 years include a 2003 busing protest that involved a 10% hike in the cost of buses in Sao Paulo, spiraled into a mass movement that took over the streets and eventually led to the mass protests across the country. I have here on screen a picture of the National Senate, National Congress, being taken over by individuals who are protesting the government. This was initially meant to be a movement that was representing the marginalized, the poor, individuals who didn't have money to pay for transportation, rising transportation costs. They had to go to work, they had to travel in these highly dense, highly populated cities, and more or less having a transportation cost go up is like having an obligatory income tax being placed on you. You have to travel. You can't get a car. Even if you can't get a car, it's more expensive. Cars are more expensive in Brazil than they are in the United States. It is not treated as a right as it is sort of in the United States. That's debatable, of course, but we see that the bus unrests were directly related to turnstile jumpers and youth who were really upset that they were trying to enter and participate in the economy. And the way the elite, those in authority, were treating them was unequal, was oppressive. So, problematic with this, we see a very real form of oppression getting transformed soon into a more token form of resistance. This is something that was mentioned by James Scott in his work concerning the art of resistance in peasant Malaysia. We see that often there is a form of real resistance that gets co-opted, that gets appropriated by those in power. How did this take place in the 2013 bus unrest? At this time, we see that a socialist-leaning government is in power, and they are encouraged and inspired by expanding the access to social services and public services throughout the country. They dramatically expand the access to busing, coincidentally, and also a whole lot of other resources. What these initial protests were protesting weren't necessarily the government or the political party, the Workers' Party, Partido dos Trabalhadores, that was in power, but arguing against a form of more broader socioeconomic marginalization that was taking place in the country. And to some degree, these marginalized voices were being supported and encouraged by the Workers' Party. They were more or less the base of the Workers' Party. Quickly, however, though, these initial protests were appropriated by national media, which often skews against the working class and often promotes the ambitions of global capital. They're owned by billionaires, these networks, and they often support the ambitions of wealthy people who are often more apt to draw sponsors and produce more income for the networks themselves as well. What does this do then? What happens when the news networks who traditionally support the wealthy elite are encouraging the protest of a bus service? They are trying to stoke resentment against the government, who is socialist, who is taxing them, who is building social programs for the poor and the marginalized that they don't like. So we see here a opposite result of what was intended. Instead of preventing the rise in bus fares and the increased protections of marginalized consumers in modern day Brazil, we see that there is a renewed force among the opponents, both ideological and political, of the socialist government in Brazil. So, alongside marginalized poor students who are unable to pay the busing fees that are going up in Sao Paulo, we see that there's a number of wealthy and elite individuals who are going out and supporting these unrests. They start tearing up documents and symbols of the Workers' Party, and they start mobilizing politically against the Workers' Party. So they really find an opportunity to organize against the people who are in power. So we see this turns from a real form of resistance to a more token form of resistance. Fast forwarding to 2016, we have the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, the first woman president in Brazilian history. She was a member of the Workers' Party, and she becomes the target of a broad corruption scandal that is quickly developing in Brazil, the car wash corruption scandal, which is more or less the hiding of money through the washing of money through small services, small businesses that don't exist. And this was mostly public project money that was being skimmed off 3 or 4% at a time and going directly towards the politicians and the wealthy who were implementing the projects. Dilma Rousseff was never accused of taking money directly, and she was never accused of benefiting directly or ordering directly this form of corruption. Nonetheless, it drew a lot of people to the streets. We can see here the impeachment banner. It's sort of cut off a little bit there, but this was an important symbol. There's a inflatable doll of one of the former socialist presidents, President Lula, who is someone who is also very important. I'll talk about him in a second. But they would go through the streets of all major cities in Brazil, protesting, banging pans. This is a common thing you see, panelada. You see that there's a lot of individuals going through the streets throughout South America and Latin America, banging their pots in protest of politicians. It's a common political activity. We see this happening in Brazil over the course of 2016. Eventually leads to the impeachment of Dilma. It's not for necessarily robbing anybody or stealing money publicly, but committing an accounting error in Brazil's budgetary process. She was more or less paying for programs she wasn't supposed to, and this is what the impeachment accused her of and convicted her of. What was the result of this now? This form of resistance that was typically taken by the ideological and political opponents of Dilma and the Workers' Party. We see that almost immediately there is a number of austerity measures that are put into place. Social programs are broken down, rising prices for all forms of public services as well. And we see that there is a severe hobbling or disempowering of social movements, marginalized social movements throughout Brazil. So we see something that started off not necessarily as a real form of oppression. It was something that stemmed from a group of relatively elite and privileged Brazilians against a government that was trying to implement policies that would benefit the marginalized and the socioeconomically oppressed. Obviously, you can imagine there's a bunch of different arguments depending on which side of the aisle you are on here, but we see that there is a form of resistance, an organized form of resistance that helps to contribute to the further oppression of the socioeconomically marginalized. And just some products of this, some of the unintended consequences of this that took place was a dramatic escalation in the unemployment rate in Brazil, the weakening of the real, the sinking of a number of social projects that were helping to dramatically expand access. Opponents would argue that all of those things are good for the Brazilian people in the long run, but you can see that it helps the wealthy. It does not help the socioeconomically marginalized. So once again, this was a token form of resistance. And then we have, in more modern times, the Lula Livre movement. This is something that took place in 2018, 2019. Lula, the former president, was arrested on corruption charges. Supposedly, he owned a duplex or a triplex in a seaside community that he did not have his name on the paper. So someone was a straw buyer. He owned the home, and he was able to wash money or launder money through this building. He eventually gets arrested. He gets arrested at a time when he is a presidential candidate, and he is the leading presidential candidate. So he would have been capable of returning a lot of those socioeconomic programs that were helping the poor and the marginalized. There was a movement. It wasn't as big as the movements in 2013 or 2016. Definitively, it was still a movement. You would still go to plazas and you'd still go to public spaces, and there'd be thousands of people protesting and demanding the return of Lula, or the freedom for Lula, Lula Livre, freedom, free Lula. We see this happening often. Nonetheless, it's not as disruptive as the 2013 bus unrest that included millions of people on the street, and the 2016 impeachment process, which also pushed millions of people on the street. And it eventually did result in the return of Lula to the world. He got out of jail, but it was more or less a number of court documents and court filings. It wasn't executive action that allowed him to be released. It was a procedural method during a time of supervised release. So we can see possibly that this was a form of resistance that represented marginalized and the oppressed, or by returning a corrupt politician, if you consider him corrupt, it could also be considered a form of token resistance, because it A, didn't achieve anything, and B, was meant to reassert a form of elite power. This is a debate we can have, and I think something that really shows that the idea of resistance is subjective and represents individuals' experience and position in the world. So, in conclusion, we can think, what's the future of resistance? How can we apply resistance to other global contexts? How can we apply it to new forms of social struggle and social inequality? I have an image here of Star Wars and the rebels. We can think that they too are resisting oppression in many ways of the evil empire. They're using the Force, and they blow up some Death Stars. And I don't know if that necessarily is effective, but it definitely was a real form of resistance. I think it's a good example of how we can see in the future, looking at different forms of power and authority, how they're going to restructure themselves, how technology is going to play into resistance. I think social media is one way that we can see resistance being executed in our modern society. And we also don't know who is going to participate, who's going to be economically marginalized in the future, and who's going to be doing the oppression. So we can keep an open-ended look at this, and we can do a good job of identifying forms of oppression, supporting forms of real resistance, and challenging forms of token resistance.